Welcome to Impactful Chats, Episode 6, Part 1. I'm Malin Martinez, and today I'm chatting with members of Students for Ethical Admissions. Welcome, guys.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us, Dr. Martinez.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So there have been major concerns about how the AAMC handled their response to COVID-19 this application cycle. You guys are here today because you all are either applying to medical school or taking the MCAT this year or both, and were somehow negatively impacted by those changes. Can you just start by telling me about each of your personal experiences this application cycle?
Yeah, so I'm a traditional pre-med, and my experience actually hasn't been as horrible as a bunch of other people's. I've been having a lot of issues with one of my transcripts that they can only send it as a paper copy, and the processing times are just outrageous for it. But my biggest problem was when I actually went to take the MCAT, the testing facility was not keeping up to the cleaning protocol. The hand scanner and the eyeglass checker was never sanitized between uses. The students didn't even have to use hand sanitizer in between uses. And then the employee actually told me that once I got in there, I could take my mask off, which obviously I did not, but some students did. And none of the desks or the keyboards were cleaned at all. The lockers were not cleaned, and there was no sanitation other than a little container of half empty hand sanitizer. So it was not up to par with what it should have been given the crazy transmission of COVID-19 that's happening right now.
I see. And do you remember exactly what date that was?
Yes, that was on June 19th.
Oh, wow, I see. And had they communicated to you before sort of what the hygiene was going to be and how social distancing was going to be maintained?
Yeah, well, they claim that it's supposed to be up to par, and they say that it's good and everyone's 6 feet apart and everyone wears their masks. But when you're going in there and people are taking off their masks, obviously that complicates that. And if the employees are allowing that, there's obviously some sort of communication problem between Pearson and AAMC because they're not enforcing the same rules or standards.
I see. And did the other two want to tell your stories about this application cycle?
Yeah, so I am a fairly traditional applicant, and I currently live in a hotspot on the West Coast, and I have had a lot of issues. I'm from a quarter school, and so I've been working really tightly with my advisor as we go through this process, and she's always reassured me that for quarter schools, it's very typical for students to submit slightly later, which for us would be late June when our transcripts are finalized. But this year, that has posed a huge complication to the application cycle because many institutions were not prepared to send transcripts in this new working from home format. So my institution has had really poor communication between the registrar and students. So for me, that's resulted in me sending my transcript about 6 times, including to myself, because each time I've sent it, it's come to me incorrect, missing really key information that the application needs to have. So I've had to keep resending and requesting. My registrar can't pick up the phone and they can't respond to emails. And so, because they're so overwhelmed. So it's been weeks of this. It's been about 4 weeks total since I've tried to send my transcript. And that has resulted in my most recent transcript not even being sent until a few days ago. And where AAMC comes into this is that they're saying that it's going to take them up to 8 weeks to verify our applications. So in addition to the slow turnaround from my school, there's a really slow turnaround from the AAMC, and my application very well may not be verified until after transmission happens.
I see. So after the deadline for submitting your application, is that what you mean?
It's actually the date that the AAMC makes our applications available to med schools is what the transmission date is. So it's not necessarily due until October, but they're going to allow the med schools to start looking at us, those of us who are verified, much sooner. And that's going to disproportionately affect students who couldn't get their applications verified in time. which may have nothing to do with their own planning or their own personal choices, and has a lot more to do with their institution or current issues regarding the mail systems and COVID.
Yes, most medical schools work on a rolling admissions system, and your institution actually does not, Dr. Martinez, but one of the few that doesn't. And so that means that you are advantaged the sooner you apply in the application cycle. So applicants the application opens on the first week of May, I believe. And you have until the end of May to complete the application and submit it. And then they take about a month to process the applications, and they get transmitted to the schools, usually the first week of June. This year they delayed it to the first week of July. But they've also delayed, the transcripts have been delayed, MCAT scores have been delayed. So students who took the MCAT in January and have a score and happen to have all of their transcripts in because their school does electronic transcripts, they are automatically put at an advantage in the admissions process because their application is going to be reviewed by the schools and they're going to be invited for interviews significantly sooner. And that's not that those of us who didn't have that, like who weren't, it's not like we weren't on top of it. It's that it's issues beyond our control.
Right. And this isn't, it sounds like, not an issue of meeting a deadline, but of being in sort of a line of people who are being assessed and being later in that assessment. And so you're at a disadvantage for that reason.
Exactly.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And some med schools say like, oh, like we just won't be as serious about rolling admissions this cycle. And some say that, and that's fine. And that's great. And we really appreciate that. But there's quite a few med schools that are saying, well, no, rolling admissions are still really important to us. And I guess, you know, if you can't get your application in on time, you may just have to reapply next year. And that's something that all of us really have some issues with because of the finance concerns with doing that and numerous other issues.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so there's a third person. Do you want to tell your story of what's happened with you this admission cycle?
Yeah, sure. So I am on the East Coast in a hot spot as well, in kind of a newer hot spot.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been trying to take this test since March. And I have been rescheduled as of yesterday now 5 times, canceled last minute, and kind of just been dragged along. I feel like I've been dragged along. I just have to keep extending my studying. I was ready to take it in March. Now I'm performing worse on my practice exams than I was back then. But my primary concern is that the communication has been so poor, and it's started to feel very clear to me that the AAMC I have to think of the best way to word this. It's become apparent that they will say something to us, and then their word will not, like that the outcome will not be consistent with what we were told. So for example, the social distancing in the test centers, or the transcript verification, they consistently say there's no delay on application verification, which is not true. And it just kind of feels overall like they sometimes know that we may not be able to have a successful cycle this year, and that they're okay with that. And I don't know if the other people on this call can kind of endorse that or not, but.
Yes, because back in March when this first started happening, a lot of us got together on Twitter just out of, we had to make a Twitter because that's how they communicate. But we were talking to AAMC on the comments about how these are our concerns. We don't think we're going to be able to test. Like, the pandemic's only going to get worse. We all knew that. But the AAMC assured us that we would all be able to test and we would all be able to apply this cycle with no problem. And, you know, nothing was addressed. They just kind of wrote us off and then claimed that it was going to be fine. And now it's July and it's not fine. You know, like, the problems that we thought were going to happen are happening, and their assurances fell through. So it's very frustrating for a lot of people.
Right. People spent exorbitant amounts of money to apply, because I mean, it's really expensive to apply to medical school, and people spent exorbitant amounts of money to apply because we were promised that we would be able to safely take the MCAT this summer, and that this process would be different than normal application cycles because everything is different this year, but that we had allies at the AAMC and on admissions committees who were understanding of what we were going through, and that's just kind of not played out. Now we're getting to where people at AAMC and at admissions committees will say, well, it's not a big deal if you just have to apply next year. You're only out the money.
Which is not acceptable for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Like I have a friend who has given up on applying this cycle because of safety concerns for taking the MCAT, and they're out the money. So they're just not going to apply at all, ever. And that's their whole life changed because of this, that was their plan.
That must be so difficult. It sounds so frustrating. Have any of you personally or know anyone who has had any issues with requests for accommodations?
Yes, I have, and I've actually, a lot of students have reached out to me about their experience applying for accommodations. It's I've had to read a lot of laws in the process, which has been interesting, but I have used academic accommodations my entire life for a learning disability since I was in elementary school. And I had 15 plus years of testing and documentation for this, and had been using accommodations consistently all the way through school. And when I went to apply for accommodations on the MCAT, I had to get repeat testing, which cost about $1,000 in the city where I live. There's other students who have said that it's significantly more depending on where you live in the country. And it takes 8 to 12 hours of testing. And I had to have my academic records all the way back through middle school and submit all of this stuff online. And then it went through a 60-day review with an anonymous reviewer. So I'm not really sure what that person's qualifications even are, and was rejected because their argument was that I had shown academic success previously. So they said I have intellectual abilities sufficient enough to compensate for any, quote, areas of unevenness in the cognitive profile. So they said basically, because you've done well in school, you don't get the extended time on this exam that has allowed you to do well in school all along.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that sounds so frustrating. Oh my goodness.
And then if you want to appeal it, you have to appeal it by mail. You have to print everything out and ship it to them and then wait, and it's a final decision. So people spend several $1,000s getting accommodations, and then we couldn't even schedule our MCATs online like everybody else. So most students with accommodations are now testing in September, which is too late to apply the cycle.
I see. Oh, wow. And I guess so that brings us to an important next question then, that I think probably ties into the answer to this question. How and why did you guys start Students for Ethical Admissions?
Yeah, so the AAMC has been primarily communicating through Twitter. So a lot of us, myself included, we didn't have Twitter. So when the cancellations happened back in March, we all got Twitter so that we could, find out when the rescheduling system would open, and then there's a whole fiasco with the system crashing. So you needed to have a Twitter if you were going to be able to reschedule your exam. So basically we all met on the comments of a bunch of AAMC posts, and we realized that this wasn't just happening to us, it's happening to everyone, and it's happening to some people more intensely than it is to other people. So we started talking, and we basically just realized this is a necessity. If we don't speak up for ourselves and for our friends, no one else is going to speak up for us. And that's not acceptable because, we've done nothing to be put at such a disadvantage. We're just taking the MCAT later, So we decided to make this so that we can try and promote equity in this admission cycle, which hopefully we're getting somewhere. But It's not for fun, and it's honestly really infuriating sometimes hearing some of their stories.
Yeah. So as this group that you formed, the Students for Ethical Admissions, if you guys could choose 3 achievable top priorities, what would you ask the AAMC to change immediately?
So guys, do we want to do 2 and 3 first, since number 1 is kind of the bigger one? Or
yeah, that's a good call.
On our list.
We can do that. So you want to do transmission and then boycott?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to still do transmission?
Sure. So I guess kind of the first thing that we would really like AAMC to do is to delay the transmission of applications at least until August, because many colleges and universities have been closed since March, and transcripts have been delayed since then. And the AAMC failed to prepare an efficient way to verify applications. They didn't check their PO box, for example, to open the envelopes with people's paper transcripts for several weeks. And so that has resulted in this delay in application verification. What's usually been about a 2 to 3 week process, they're now saying is going to take up to 8 weeks. And this hurts almost everyone, but especially students in the quarter system, because they finished their semesters in mid to late June. So many students are going to have the current transmission date come before their application is even verified. So they're going to be put at the end of the list, which that's at no fault of their own.
Yeah. Okay.
So our next desire is, do you want to do this one, Lainey?
No, it's okay, sorry.
Oh, it's okay, you can go ahead. I think since we reorganized, it would make more sense if you spoke.
Okay, so the AAMC has put out a lot of new platforms this cycle, which is a little questionable because they've not been tested. And one of them is called Vita. It's basically that you record yourself doing an interview. It's just a couple minutes long, and supposedly schools are supposed to use this, and it's through a hiring service that has an AI that is known to discriminate against, people of color, women, people who have different inflections in their voice, because it was only tested on white males. So obviously we're not too excited about this, and it's also like the interview is supposed to be a conversation between the school and the applicant. So we've been worried about that. So a big thing that we are pushing for is boycotting the Vita service, because it's just, we don't need another obstacle to go through. We don't need another system when there's already Zoom, there's already Skype. We have so many platforms where we could actually talk back and forth with our schools. So that's a big thing that we want to get rid of. And hopefully schools will choose not to utilize that.
Yeah, I think luckily, I think it sounds like it's a handful of programs that have decided to use that, at least at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they tried to use it a few years ago for the emergency medicine residencies, and it was not popular or successful then. So I think a lot of schools that have teaching hospitals affiliated were like,
Gotcha. Yeah.
We'll back off. Yeah.
Okay. What about your third priority?
So our third priority is the priority that you can see on your screen. We want admissions committees and the AAMC to waive the MCAT and stop offering the exam for the rest of this cycle. And we can break this down to a few key problems, keeping in mind that the goal of waiving this exam is to improve equity, which has been severely lacking in this cycle. So for those who were not taking the MCAT this spring, they may not be exactly familiar with what happened. So just for a brief overview, there was a huge disturbance to the MCAT cycle because there was a cancellation of about 3 months of exams for March, April, and June. And the AAMC rescheduled us to compensate for June, July, and August. And their new rescheduled exams are 5 hours and 45 minutes compared to the old exams, which were about over 7 hours. So the exam that they're offering now is not the same as what they were offering before. And this disruption in itself has provided a significant barrier to pre-medical school applicants, especially underrepresented minorities, as we have now been asked to push out our study window by months at a time, which does not take into account if we have work or school obligations or family. And it's a very big deal to prep for the MCAT. I'm sure most people are aware, and many people have been preparing this for 6 months, a year, 3 months. So this additional 3-month push time has had a huge impact on people's mental health, as we've now been dealing with the fact that we're in a pandemic and we have a really intense racial climate. And the same qualities that drive us to want to become physicians are making us want to help our communities right now who are suffering from COVID and suffering from racial injustice. But we're being asked not to prioritize those very important issues and instead to focus on continuing studying for something that we've studied for now 5 months, 6 months, a year. And that's just been very difficult, particularly for underrepresented minorities who've been put in a tough spot as they have to choose between attending protests and studying, or perhaps trying not to get arrested, leaving a late AAMC exam because the MCAT is now offered during nighttime windows, which can sometimes go against local curfews. So that puts our minority students in a very bad and possibly dangerous position. Furthermore, all of these exams are still being offered in person as COVID transmission is still raging on throughout the country. And again, this pandemic in itself is disproportionately affecting immunocompromised people and Black and Latino communities. And so by virtue of even attending this exam, we are threatening to spread this pandemic and put these communities further at risk. But the AAMC and admissions committees seem to think that this is a reasonable risk for us to take for this exam. We're looking at a situation where students have reported unsafe testing protocols, are expected to test in these small unventilated rooms with other test takers who could very well be carriers, and we could possibly get sick and infect our communities and our families. If you wouldn't go to a restaurant right now, why would you go sit and take an indoor test for almost 6 hours? And as we talked about earlier, some students have reported examinees removing masks after the exam begins. One of our friends reported that she was the only person wearing a mask by the time she was done, which is terrifying to me. And they've reported social distancing less than 6 feet at testing centers. Exam cancellations have also required students to reschedule at the last minute, which forces them to continue reusing old testing materials and try to further spread out their testing deadline.
Wow, yeah, that sounds like an important priority then. And what are your 3 most pressing questions for the AAMC?
I think sorry.
Go ahead. Okay, so I think that kind of one big thing is that we obviously have quite a few questions for the AAMC, which are outlined in our document at the link on the screen. Mm-hmm. And we also kind of want to also direct these questions towards medical schools and admissions committees as well, because one thing we've realized through this is that AAMC can set the framework and then the medical schools have to work within that framework. And so some of the changes that we're demanding have to come from leaders at medical schools, like at Stanford University. They've just made the MCAT optional for this cycle.
Right.
So these questions kind of also, as we go through them, want to emphasize that these are also directed towards admissions committees.
Gotcha.
So one big question that I had was based off of a statistic that the AAMC gave us about why they cannot administer the MCAT remotely, which is what we were originally fighting for really hard, so that people would not be risking their health in person. They said that 20% of students don't have stable internet access. So how would it be equitable if they gave it remotely, because it would affect some people and they would not be able to do well on it? And to that I say, okay, if they don't have the internet access, how do you expect them to study? How do you expect them to use the Vita? How do you expect them to use the new SJT that came out that's just like Casper? Their statistic shows that they're trying to be equitable, but it's just not the right lens of equitability. So my question is, if we see that there's this problem and we can't come up with a solution about it, why are we taking so long to waive the MCAT? Because we know that this is disproportionately affecting underrepresented minorities and students with disabilities. And the medical field is already very lacking in diversity. So as medical institutions, we should see these statistics and we should realize that like, this is something that we need to do to improve the system. This is something that we should jump on the opportunity to do, because the MCAT is already very biased and perpetuates a lot of different discrepancies in medical representation. So the fact that they see this statistic and they offer it to us, like, it's just, there's a lack of self-awareness there that I just wanted to address.
Okay. And was there one last question? A third question for the AAMC?
We had
Yeah.
2.
You had 2? Okay. So those are your...
Grace, do you want to do the ADA violations?
Yeah, so I guess my question is less related to MCAT, but more, is the AAMC planning to respond to these, in my mind, very genuine concerns about ADA and Rehab Act violations? And are they planning to address that? Because multiple students have reported that AAMC has reached out to them saying the director of accommodations would love to talk to you about your experience, and they've tried to schedule that, and either that call has never happened or they've kind of been brushed off. So I kind of would love to know what AAMC's plan is for that going forward and how they plan to make this right. Because I don't think it takes a disability expert to know that students with disabilities have been disadvantaged in this cycle.
Right. Okay, well, those are good questions, and I think you guys are prioritizing really well, and you're doing a great job of getting your message out. I hope that this helps your message get to the right people. I know you've been in touch with the AAMC, and hopefully this will just emphasize what you guys are really focused on. So thank you.
Do you think we have time for one brief statement, sort of our closing statement?
Of course.
The main message that I would like to send to the AAMC is to ask them, when the next generation of doctors is admitted to medical schools and the pool is even more white, wealthy, and privileged than in previous years, does the AAMC plan to apologize for making it harder for underrepresented minorities to apply to medical school this year? Or are they again going to brush off accountability?
Okay, that's a good question. Well, thank you guys again for getting your message out, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for watching Impactful Chats.